Welcome back to the channel. I'm glad you're here. In this week's video, we're going to make some resin rust. So if you want to see how I do that, grab a drink, pull up a chair, and stick around. Alright, so we got this slab of walnut here, and my plan for this is to turn it into a couple of side tables with an epoxy river down the center. Now with the size of this board, I should be able to get about 2 tops out of it. So to start with this project, I just want to square up the sides. And I'll just be doing this with a circular saw and a piece of flat bar steel as my guide. It's the poor man's track saw. It doesn't look pretty, it's a little bit of a pain, but she works. Now, full disclosure, I did forget to hit the record button when I was doing the cut here, so the footage you're seeing is from a previous project, but cutting a straight line is cutting a straight line, so I think she'll do. Now, as you can see, this board here that we're working with isn't anywhere close to level, so we're gonna go ahead and take care of that over at the router sled. We're just gonna start by flattening out what's gonna end up being the top of these tables. My reasoning for only flattening up one side first is that since we're gonna pour resin into this, we're gonna have to flatten the whole thing again anyways. But since I'm also gonna be adding iron powder to the resin, I wanna make sure the top is as flat as possible because I'll be putting this slab into the mold box upside down. So during the pour, the top will be on the bottom will be on the top. And I'm hoping to mitigate as much resin as possible from seeping underneath as the resin sets up. We'll see how she goes. Now there's still some leftover bark on the live edges here. So to clean that up, I'm just gonna use my orbital sander with some 80 grit sandpaper. When I'm cleaning up live edges with an orbital sander, I like to go in on a bit of an angle using the edge of the sander itself. I find this cleans up any debris you need to quickly, as well it's a lot easier to keep the overall form of the live edge itself without flattening it out too much. So we're just about ready for the resin pour, and at this point in the project, I'm wondering to myself if it makes more sense to just cut this in half and do everything in one pour, or since I'm hoping to get 2 tops out of this board here, if it makes sense to cut everything into quarters and then just do 2 pours. So ultimately I decide to just cut the board in half and do everything in one pour. So I'm just finding a center line on the board, and just like before, we're going to cut this in half using the circular saw. Okay, so we got our mold box here. I just made this out of some melamine board. The tuck tape you see here is to help with the demolding process. Resin doesn't really like sticking to it, but if you felt like it, you could also use a release agent. And then all the seams are just sealed up with some cheap latex caulking. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm placing the boards into the mold box upside down. My reason for doing this is since the resin's going to have iron powder in it, as the resin's setting up, the iron powder is going to want to start sinking to the bottom, which in this case is going to be the top of our side tables. And since this pour is about 3/4 of a gallon of resin, if I want to do this all in one go, the amount of iron powder that would need to be used would be about 1/3 of the overall volume. And a pour like this, that's not only adding some extra cost, but I'm also not 100% sure if it would affect the overall integrity of the resin itself. As well, if the table that you're using isn't completely level, the iron powder in the resin is going to want to sink to the lowest point as the resin's setting up. So when you bring everything back to the router table, it could leave you with some unwanted bare spots. Me saying all this is probably just foreshadowing for what's to come. Now before I start pouring a whole bunch of resin, I want to do a seal coat and a print coat. So for this I'm using a faster setting resin. Now my reason for doing this is to help mitigate any of the resin from seeping underneath the boards as it sets up. I mixed up around 4 ounces of resin for the print coat. I also added about 2 or 3 ounces of the metal powder, which at the end of the day wasn't overly helpful. You'll see that later on when we go back to planing the surface. To do the seal coat, I'm just using a chip brush and later on my fingers. You'll also notice that one side of the board is missing. The only reason I did this was the spacing between the 2 boards just made it difficult for me to get my hands and the brush in between them. So depending on your project, this might not be a necessary step. To do the seal coat on the other half of the table, I just did it outside the mold box, and then once done, I put it back into the mold box, and my hope is that the wet resin, as it's setting up, will drip down a little bit and help seal up the edge. And once we get the second half back into the mold box, I'm just going to go ahead and use the remaining bit of metal infused resin to do a print coat over the surface of the mold. So I've let the seal coat set up for a couple hours. Now what I'm doing is mixing up resin for the first pour. I'll be adding a small amount of black tint to this. This is mainly to give the iron powder a little bit of a background color. I'm doing this to give a bit of added color to the iron, just in case there's any voids or missed spots. So this is going to be the first of 2 resin pours infused with iron powder. Now you may notice as I'm doing the pour, the resin right now has almost a primer gray color to it, and that's because of the iron mixed into the resin. But as we go over to the second pour, you'll notice the tint of the resin is more or less black. That's because the iron powder is sunk to the bottom of our mold box. Now this resin here isn't fully set up, so my hope is as we're doing the second pour, that the iron will have enough weight to soak through both layers, if that makes any sense at all. Now, once I started cleaning up the top half of our slab here, it quickly started to become apparent that not only was the layer of iron powder not thick enough, but also the table I had it setting up on was out of level just enough for a large enough amount of the iron powder to start settling on one side over the other. What this ended up doing was it left one part of the board completely void of any iron powder, and the other half of the board maybe being coated with about 2/3 of the iron powder. Now I can definitely work with this, but it's definitely time to start thinking on my feet here. So before we go any further, I'm just going to go ahead and square up all the sides on our slab and then cut the slab in half. So this might be counterintuitive to some, but the part of the slab I'm going to choose to make rust is the side where I planed out all of the iron infused resin, or is that resin infused iron? Unforeseen mishaps like this, well, they're a great time to adapt and overcome. It's very rarely anything goes 100% according to plan, and when you don't have much of a plan to begin with, you're lucky if you get 20 or 30%. That all being said, this is what my new plan is going to be. I'm going to use the edge of my oscillating sander here, and then I'm going to start sanding out the resin until I get a low point. This will be the new home for some resin infused iron, which we can then sand to level and hopefully make rust. So once we clean up all the residue from the sanding, we're just going to go ahead and mix up about 2 ounces of resin, add in a little bit of black tint, and then about another ounce of the iron powder, and then give all that a good mix. I'm also going to dam up both sides of the board with some tuck tape. This is just to help keep the resin all in one place. Next, I'm just going to pour all the resin onto the river that we've sanded down, and then I'm just going to use a chip brush to help spread everything around, keeping it as even as I can, and then letting the resin self-level. So as we're waiting for the resin to set up, I'm going to move on to building the legs for the side table. So what I got here is a 4" by 1/4" piece of flat bar. Ultimately, this is going to be the connection point between our tabletop and the legs. I'm going to cut this down to 3 pieces, first being at 12 inches and the next 2 pieces being at 4 inches each. Then I'm going to go ahead and start welding them together. After I've gone ahead and cleaned up the welds with a grinder, I'm going to add some holes to this connection piece. This is so bolts will be able to connect with the threaded inserts that'll be put into the tabletop later on. I'm going to then build the center and the feet of the base. So for this, I'm just using some square tube steel and then doing more of the same, cutting everything down with an angle grinder and welding it all together. Now I do want to mention for the feet of this base, I'm putting a 45-degree angle on each end. That's really just for looks. And then I'm repurposing a threaded insert meant for wood legs. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow me to thread in some leveling feet just in case the floor that this table ends up living on isn't overly level. Now I want to make the base look a little bit more interesting. Right now it just looks like 2 lowercase t's welded together. So I'm going to cut down some rebar and then go ahead and weld it onto the base in some sort of upside down cone pattern. There's no real rhyme or reason or design philosophy as to why I'm doing this. I'm just really experimenting here, and I thought it might look cool. So our resin on our tabletop's all set up now. So I'm just going to use my palm sander to sand it back down to level with the rest of the board. So for the shape of this tabletop, I decided to go with an octagon. I'm just tracing out the shape of the octagon on the board with a template I made on my 3D printer. Once I was happy with the placement, I brought it over to my miter saw and cut everything down to its final shape. Here I'm going to add a round over to the top of our tabletop here, and then on the bottom I want to add a chamfer. Again, there's no real rhyme or reason why I'm putting a round over on the top and a chamfer on the bottom. I just think it'll look good. And the last thing I want to do before we make this resin rust is give everything one last sand with 220 grit. Alright, so now we're at the point where we can rust the river portion of this tabletop. And to do that, it's pretty simple. All I'm going to do is pour a few capfuls of vinegar over top of the river and then just let it sit. The vinegar is going to make quick work of oxidizing the iron powder trapped in the resin, and in a couple hours we'll be left with a rusted surface. So as you can see, we were successful in getting this river to rust, but this also left us with an issue. As the rusting process was going on, the spillover ended up staining the surface of the wood. Now, since hindsight is 2020, this could have been easily avoided if I just made a dam using some caulking across the perimeter of the resin itself. But hey, you learn by making mistakes. So my first thought to fix this was to sand everything out. At the end of the day, the amount of sanding I would have had to do would have left me with even bigger problems, that being an uneven tabletop surface. So I went ahead and asked the great internet what I should do to get rust out of the surface of wood. I found this product called Barkeeper's Friend. So I just mixed that up with a little bit of water, applied it to the affected area, and just let it sit for a little while before I cleaned it off. After we've let the Barkeeper's Friend soak in for a little while, I'm just coming back with a clean cloth and some water, wiping everything clean and letting the wood dry. And as you can see here, the Barkeeper's Friend did a pretty good job removing the rust from the surface of our tabletop here. So the last thing I want to do before we add some finish to the surface of this wood here is just give everything one last sand with 220 and then a quick clean to remove any leftover debris. To finish the surface of this tabletop, I'm using a 2-part hard wax finish. This finish is similar to Rubio Monocoat, however it's about half the price. If you're at all interested, I'll leave links for it in the description below. Basically with this stuff, all you do is once you mix the 2 parts together, evenly spread it out onto the surface of what you're working on, then you just let it soak in for a couple of minutes, and with a clean cloth wipe off all the excess. And then before I do anything else, I like to give the finish a day or so to set up. Once the finish is set up, I'm going to drill out some holes in the bottom of the tabletop. These are going to be used for threaded inserts that'll help secure the table legs to the tabletop itself. Since this whole project has more or less just been one big experiment to see if we could make resin rust and what that would look like in the end, I want to add some rust to the steel legs that we built here. And to do that, it's the same thing. I just put a little bit of vinegar into the spray bottle and then just spray down the surface and walk away for a little bit. And after a couple hours, we've now got some rusted out metal legs. Now I want to stop this table from rusting any further. So what I got here is a can of rust inhibiting satin clear coat. I'm just going to go ahead and give the legs a few coats of this and let it dry. When I was looking at the table legs here, I felt that I wanted to tone down the overall appearance of the rust. So to do that, I just took a can of flat black spray paint and just hit a few key areas. And this did help tone down the rust a little bit. After doing that, I decided I wanted to add a bit more texture to it. So using the same black spray paint, what I did was I ripped up part of a sponge, sprayed some of the paint onto the work surface, dabbed my torn up sponge in the pool of paint, and then just dabbed it onto a few parts of the surface. The hope that I had for this is that it gives the legs sort of a chipped paint appearance with some rust peeking out from underneath. These table legs might not win any awards, but so far this has been a pretty fun project to work on. And the last thing to do there is go ahead and attach the base, and that's it, we're done. This is definitely a build I really enjoyed doing. It was for sure a learning experience, and it's a resin pouring process that I'd like to keep working on and refining, though I am fairly certain that this style of river table isn't for everybody. Anyways, if you made it this far, I really want to thank you for watching the video. I hope you got something out of it, and if you did, or you want to see more projects like this, click that subscribe button. Anyways, thanks again for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.